Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dr. Abdul Nasser, I think it's time to start.
Yes, you can start.
Right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the third session of today's symposium entitled the International Symposium for Adoption of FOSS to Thrive Intelligent Education and Digital Economy. In this session, we have three presentations. We will start the first with Vicky Brasseur. Welcome, Vicky. I'll give you just a short bio about Vicky. Vicky is going to talk about what is an open source supply chain and why does it matter. Vicky Brasseur spent most of her 20+ years in the tech industry in leading software development departments and teams. She provided corporate strategy, technical management, and leadership consulting for businesses. She also helped companies understand, use, release, and contribute to free and open source software in a way that is good for both their bottom line and the community. She also authored the Forge Your Future with Open Source, the first and only book detailed how to contribute to free open source software projects. Vicky also was the moderator and the author of opensource.com, and she's still up to now. Also, she's an author of the Linux Journal, the vice president of the Open Source Initiative, and is a frequent and popular speaker at free open source conferences and events. She's proud for winning actually the Pearl White Camel Award in 2014, the Orally Open Source Award also in 2016, and 2 opensource.com Moderators Choice Awards in 2018 and 2019. Welcome, Vicky. The floor is yours. You have up to 45 minutes, and after you finish, then we will have some time to receive questions from the audience.
Excellent. Well, I have time built into my talk to accept questions. Welcome, everyone. I'm very grateful for you being here. Let me see. Let me share my screen. That screen right there. Share. Okay, that is working. So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me here for what is an open source supply chain and why does it matter? Just very briefly about me. As you heard in my bio, I don't really have to say much more than that. So thank you very much for that very good bio and introduction. I am based on the West Coast of the United States in the Pacific Northwest, right in the area around Portland, Oregon. So it is approximately 10 p.m. here for me. So I understand it's approximately 10 a.m. there for you in Oman. So I hope you're having a beautiful day today. I am a director and senior strategy advisor at Wipro. Wipro has a long and wonderful history with free and open source software. We have over 20,000 developers, and they all work with and on free and open source software. We're members of over 24 communities. We have very large community internally, specifically around free and open source software. It reached, I believe, yes, it reached over 5,500 members just in the past few weeks, which is very exciting for us. We are on the board of directors of the the FinTech Open Source Foundation, the Open Source Security Foundation, and we contribute to a lot of things. So free and open source software is really in the blood of Wipro. We love it a great deal. And so we're very honored to be a part of it here in Oman. Briefly, let me let you know what we're going to cover in this talk today. I will start with an introduction to software supply chains, largely about open source, but since there is proprietary software out there, I would like to touch upon it as well. Then I'll give you some of the risks involved with software supply chains, some approaches for how people deal with it. And one of those I'll go into a little more detail, which is the DAR cycle, the Discover, Analyze, and Remediate cycle for software supply chain risks. So let's just dive right in. Oh, and briefly, I can either see my slides or I can see you. I can't see both. So if you do have any questions, please add them to the Q&A section. And I will get to them after I finish my slides, or you can just hold on to them until the end when I'm done and you can ask them at that time. But unfortunately, I can't take questions during the presentation because I can't see them. So now I will move on, and I'm going to start in the most obvious places, which is the introduction to software supply chains. The obvious question here is what even is? What is a software supply chain? That's what you're all here to learn about. Well, we're all familiar with supply chains in general. So if you want a delicious piece of cake, right? The cake, you have the farmer who grows the wheat that goes to the mill, that goes to the store as flour, and you bring it home, you bake it, and then you have tasty cake and it goes into your mouth. And that's great. But as you look at each one of these pieces, the farmer, the field, the mill, the store, your kitchen, each one of these has their own little supply chain around them. So the farmer depends upon the people who can sell them seeds, who can sell them machinery, who can build their farms, right? Who can till their fields. So that's a supply chain for the farmer. The field themselves, that has a supply chain for people to harvest the fields, to get things to the mill. The mill then has to have people who can take care of its machinery, who can sell it machinery, who can ship things in and out of the mill. That then goes to the store, and stores have a very large supply chain. Every single product that a grocery store sells has its own supply chain. And then it gets to you and your kitchen, everything you're using to cook, be it made out of metal, be it made out of wood. Unless you're making it yourself, it has a very long supply chain. If you're making it yourself, say you go outside, you cut off a piece of olive wood, you carve it into a very nice spoon that you can mix up. There's still a supply chain there. It's small, but it's a supply chain. So we're all familiar with these. We might not think about them, but we're aware of them. And once in a while, they come very much to the forefront of our minds, such as when a ship gets wedged in the canal and nobody can get through the Panama Canal, and it backs up the international worldwide supply chain. And these are things that, really bring things to the forefront. And in software supply chains, we have similar problems, right? That things that will bring supply chains to the forefront. Now, supply chains themselves, though we don't think about them, they do have a definition, and I want to briefly touch upon that because I'm going to build on it for software supply chains. Now, this definition is from the American Heritage Dictionary, and I'm going to read it for the visually impaired. Software or supply chain. A supply chain is the sequence or system of organizations or operations that work together to design, produce, and deliver a product or service to a market, extending from the extraction of raw materials to the distribution of finished products or services. So that's what a supply chain is in very many words, just specifically. Now, software supply chains aren't really that different from the supply chains where we think of more often when you say supply chain. You'll have a piece of code that a developer picks up to create a program that they then put on a service that you log into and download, and you buy it and you put it on your device and you play a game, right? But each one of these boxes also has its own supply chain. That one piece of code may have needed to draw in libraries. It's based on a programming language that itself had to be written by someone. And then that programmer puts lots of different pieces of code together and then also writes their own. And each one of those pieces of code has their own supply chain. I'll go into that in more detail. That cloud, that provider there on the cloud has just almost an infinite different array of pieces involved, moving pieces. Even your browser, little things like that, that has a lot of things. That shopping cart not only has software for presenting things and for you to download it, but it also has all this interesting stuff for managing your credit cards and making sure that you're not getting double charged and making sure you're not scamming. The software that you use to run the game, each one of those little pieces also had to be written by someone and has to be maintained by someone. So this is a lot like the cake supply chain, right? There's big pieces, but each big piece is composed of small pieces, which is composed of smaller pieces. So they're very complicated. So when I went to look for a definition of software supply chains, it was easy to find a definition for regular supply chains, but I was very, very surprised that there is not one yet, at least not one readily available, that defines specifically what a software supply chain is. Everybody talks about them right now, if in that part of the world, in that part of the industry, but they all assume everybody's meaning the same thing, when I have found, in fact, they do not. And so for this talk, in this context, this is what I mean by a software supply chain. All right, I will, again, read it for the visually impaired. A software supply chain is the sequence or system of organizations or operations that work together to design, produce, and deliver a software product or service to a market, extending from the hardware and operating system to the distribution of finished software products and services. Now, this is very similar, obviously, to the one I read before because I just modified it, but it's very accurate, which is something that I was not able to find. Right? This just did not exist. So something that you probably are already aware of from 2 slides back is that nearly every single piece of software depends upon other software components. Here's the software, it depends on other software components. And this forms a chain. This is your supply chain. Now, I have an example here. Some of you are probably familiar with the concept of or the programming language Python. If you're not, don't worry. You don't have to be a software developer to understand this. It's just an example. So Python is regularly either the #1 or #2 most popular programming language in the world. It's very, very popular. And in Python, the requests module is probably one of the most popular ones out there. Everyone uses it. Now, you don't need to know what requests does, but if you're curious, it manages, essentially manages web communication stuff. That's not important to the example. What is important is that requests itself has this massive dependency chain. Now, what I give you here is only a sliver of the dependency chain based on one dependency of requests. Request depends upon Flask. That's the one dependency, which depends on python.env, import metadata, IPython, pickleshare, path to lib. It depends on all of these things. And there's more dependencies after path to lib because path to lib depends on other things as well. Now, this is only one of the many dependencies of requests, and it's only one of the many dependencies on Flask. It's just this really quite impressive tree of dependencies of things. So you can see, if you wish, the entire dependency tree for requests. It's all on GitHub. If you're not familiar with it, it is a site where you can host your software projects. So you can find the dependency tree for requests at github.com/psf/requests/network/dependencies. And it's quite an impressive list, but it's not as impressive as things get in other communities. For instance, let me change my, here we go. In the NPM and Node.js community. Now, in any community, software dependency trees can get quite complicated, but they get particularly complicated in Node.js because of the nature of the programming language. It has a lot of little components that are very, very small. And so you can build up a very complicated thing that is made out of tiny little bits, a lot like Lego, right? Whereas for Python, the Lego pieces are much bigger. For NPM, they are the tiniest possible Lego pieces that you can put together. And so that leads to a lot of dependencies because you're using more components. Now, what you're looking at on my screen here, on your screen actually, is just a small chunk of a large dependency tree for the top 100 most popular Node.js modules. And this tree was actually created several years ago, like I believe 4 years ago at this point, at the time of this recording. So it has changed a lot since then. But one thing that has not changed is that it has not become less complicated. In fact, it's probably become more so. So you would think that something like this with Node.js is perhaps the worst case scenario, but it's not, because your software that you use in your home, in your company, in your department, these are composed of things from different ecosystems. So it might have, for instance, a Node.js backend. Maybe it'll have a React front end, the part that you interact with, and your web browser. And then it might have maybe, let's say, a Python middle bit that ties the two pieces together, your back end on the server and your front end on your web browser. Each of these are very large ecosystems, and each of these will create very large dependency trees. So you can see things get a little tricky here. And that can lead to some problems because you have this software supply chain and it's very, very large, but it's also incredibly critical. It's a critical piece of infrastructure for your business operations, for your department to work, for your country to work, for anything really to function. Think of the things you do on a day-to-day basis. What happens when a piece of software breaks? When your operating system does not work? Everything kind of stops because it gets blocked because of that piece of software. And that happens often because of a problem with the software supply chain. Now I'm going to go back to that Node.js diagram I had up a couple of slides ago. Now, the question is, what happens if there is a problem with only one link in your software supply chain of all these pieces? And the answer is, it affects everything in the chain. Think about a regular chain, something that is holding a dog or holding a ship to a mooring. You've got this big chain, but as soon as one link breaks, the rest of it falls apart. The same as for software, because one thing depends on another, and when one breaks, the rest falls apart. So if, for instance, I am going to pick on the Webpack module here in the NPM ecosystem, not because of anything wrong with it, but because it was convenient and it had lots of connections to it. So sorry, Webpack people, it's nothing personal. So what happens if that Webpack module gets a malicious actor, right? A malicious actor comes along and somehow managed to get some code into Webpack that can hurt and or break your supply chain. Well, that's one risk to your supply chain, is outside influence, people who come in and do bad things to a single link of your supply chain that can break the entire thing. Another way that malicious actors take control and really mess up your supply chain is by what we call typo squatting. So Webpack is the name of a module. What if you have a named module that's very close? Say it's Webpack with a PAK instead of a PACK. Now, if I am a developer and I'm in a rush and I type it wrong in the software, in the code, and I type use Webpack, WEBPAK, done. Okay, move on. My software doesn't know. it's going to pull in the wrong package. And that wrong package can have nefarious things in it that can steal your credentials, that can get access to your network, right? That happens sometimes. It gets squashed, but it does happen. What happens more often is that a piece of your supply chain, one of those links in your supply chain, will have a bug in it. And it's happens all the time. There is no such thing as perfect software. All software has bugs. It's just they haven't been found yet, or they're not major. You find it and it's major, and you break your supply chain. Somebody has to go in and fix that link, and then things will work. But until you can link things up again, your supply chain is broken, and your company might not be able to function. That's a problem. Let's say somebody takes this module, Webpack, and they take it off of the internet. This has actually happened. There is an example where somebody has taken a very critical piece of the large software supply chain, just taken it away. Lots and lots of things broke because they were relying on it. And so it broke the supply chain. What happens? How do you deal with that? Right? What if the dependency, your link in your supply chain, it exists, but nobody's taking care of it. It gets weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, and nobody notices it's not being taken care of. And one day, just like a rusty link in your chain, it's going to break, and your chain will break as well. So there are a number of different risks that can happen in your software supply chain. And these are just open source pieces. Most of the software you use, such as your web browser or your email client or your operating system, if you're using Mac or you're using Windows, it's composed of not only open source pieces, but also proprietary pieces. And that proprietary software also has its own supply chains, except often you can't see them. So you don't know what the building blocks are that compose that piece of proprietary software. And that can, in general, both that combination of open source and proprietary and all these little pieces of software, and it's just, wow, the complexity, it's incredible. And it really makes you think, as you look at it, how did this ever work? I mean, really, this is just one little bump can just destroy my entire supply chain. Oh my goodness. This is terrible. What am I going to do? Well, sometimes, yes, there are big problems. It does happen. We actually have had 2 of them so far this year. One of them was in the Node.js community, where somebody who was a maintainer of some critical projects, he got angry and he put malicious code into his own software. And that messed things up for a little bit, but it got fixed. Another one was Log4j, which was a very, very big deal in the Java world in particular, because Log4j is a very important piece of software in the Java programming world. And that had one of those undiscovered bugs that happened to be a very bad bug. So that's this year we've had 2 already, and it's only almost March, not quite. So, you know, there's a lot of big stuff here that does happen. And yet our entire house of cards in the software world, it does not come rattling down onto the table. And that's because there are things we can do, each one of us, to make this work. And a lot of people do it, and a lot of people can do it, which is why I'm here today, is to try and introduce you to the idea not only of supply chains, but that you have agency. You can do something to make sure that you are safe and your company is safe. And most importantly, the people you serve, your constituents, your customers, that they are safe. That is the most important thing of all. Now, it might seem a little overwhelming, but the primary thing you need to consider is just one concept, and that is the software bill of materials. And there are lots of other things that you could think of, but just think of this one for now, and it's a lot easier to wrap your head around. Now, the software bill of materials, we call it SBOM. So you'll hear people talk about SBOMs all the time, and it's not this terrible thing that's going to explode in your face. It's the software bill of materials. Now, what does that mean, though? I can throw that word around, but what does it actually mean? In the United States, we have a government organization called the NTIA. It's involved with our national transportation, I believe. Telecommunications, actually, sorry. So the NTIA has done a great deal of very quality work around SBOMs, and they've been doing it for a number of years. So they're kind of leading in this place. They have a great definition of SBOMs. Thank you, NTIA. After not finding a definition of software supply chains, it was wonderful to find this one for SBOMs. And again, I will read it for the visually impaired. An SBOM is a formal, machine-readable inventory of software components and dependencies, information about those components, and their hierarchical relationships. These inventories should be comprehensive, or they should explicitly state where they could not be. SBOMs may include open source or proprietary software, and they can be widely available, open, or they can be access restricted. So this is an excellent definition of SBOMs. It covers all of the right points, and it's very, very good. So SBOMs are wonderful. And why they're wonderful for you is that it allows you to see what's going on in your world, in your supply chain. The SBOM looks at an entire ecosystem, or allows you to look at an entire ecosystem and pick out only the pieces that you care about. So if your software is written on Node.js, you don't have to care about the literally hundreds of thousands of Node.js modules out there. You only have to care about the ones in your supply chain. And you can tell that because of the SBOM. And it allows you to see that signal within the noise of the overall ecosystem. And it really makes life a lot easier for you. Now, at the bare minimum, your SBOM is going to list the name and version of every single software component that's involved. But you know, they really do involve a lot more. SBOMs give you a lot of information. And here's an example. You can find a lot of examples of SBOMs at github.com/spdx/spdx examples. But this is for SBOMs in the SPDX format. It's an SBOM format. There are other formats such as, for instance, CycloneDX, but this is SPDX. Now, you don't have to understand what this example shows on the screen because it's got a bunch of kind of coded looking things, which are checksums and hashes, which you don't need to understand. All you need to know is to look at this and see that it is very structured. It's easy to see what's going on here. You have one piece and the data. Here's the value and data, value and data, value and data. So it's very easy for a machine to generate, and it's also easy for a machine to read. And that means that you don't have to go skimming these documents by eye. You can have software that will do it for you. And there are a lot of services that can help generate and read and monitor SBOMs for you. Now, this one, again, is SPDX. SPDX is the Software Package Distribution Exchange, I believe. I might be wrong on that D. But what it actually is, and what I'm sure of, is that it is an international ISO standard for declaring SBOMs. It's currently in version 2.0. Version 3.0 is going to include even more information about security and vulnerabilities. So that's great. It's also an open source project, and so you can go and learn a lot more about it and participate. I won't go into detail about it here, but if you want more information, you can go to spdx.dev. Now, let's say you're looking at all these things and you're trying to figure out your software supply chain. How can you do that? And how can you manage your software supply chain? Well, first of all, remember, not all of your software is open source. You probably are getting software from external vendors. feel free to ask them for their SBOMs. They can provide it to you privately. That is totally okay. And they might not have it, but you're not going to know until you ask. If they do have it and you receive it, it not only shows that they are following best practices, but it also gives you more insight into your overall software supply chain and the security of it and any potential risks that you, your company, your customers might have from your supply chain. Then if you are in an organization that creates software, you can add SBOM creation tools into your development tool chain. So as you are building your software, as you're creating it and releasing it, you're also creating SBOMs that you can keep, that you can modify, that you can distribute, that you can look at, and that you can inspect. And that's the key part, is that you should always be inspecting your software supply chain for weak links, because once you have all of that data, all of those SBOMs, they don't really do much good unless you're using them. And to use them, you need to look at them. Which is what brings us to our next point, which is the DAR cycle, which is, again, discover, analyze, and remediate. And then, of course, repeat. So as you are creating and collecting your SBOMs, that's how you build up your software supply chain. Well, not build up, it exists. That's how you reveal your software supply chain. Because you can't remediate, you can't inspect what you cannot see. And what I find as I work with companies over and over and over again is they are completely unaware of what software they are using, of their software supply chain. And so therefore, they don't know what the risks are out there. It's like going for a walk out in the mountains and not knowing when you step over this big rock, you're going to step right onto a snake. It's just right there, wide open, but you're not looking. You don't know to look. And so it's going to bite you. It's going to be bad. And that's how bad it is when people aren't aware of the software in their supply chain. There's a huge risk of getting bitten, and you don't want that. So you collect the SBOMs, and that's your discovery phase. Your analyzing phase is reviewing those SBOMs and comparing them to CVEs. A CVE is a common vulnerability and exposure, which is a really fancy way to say they're bugs. They're software bugs that have been reported to MITRE, which is a special organization. So MITRE collects these software bugs and it ranks them in severity from 1 to 10, where 1 is, it's okay, and 10 is, holy crap, goodness, we must fix this immediately. This is very, very bad. The log4j was a 10. That's how bad the log4j problem was. So what you do, and the CVEs are all publicly available, you take your SBOM and you compare it to CVEs, and you look at each link and you go, this is a link in the software supply chain. Here's a CVE for a link in my software supply chain. Do they match? Are they the same name, the same version? Oh dear, if they are, then you now must remediate because you have found something that might be weakening your software supply chain. And then you can fix that. But you can't do that if you're not looking, right? Otherwise, you're just going to step on that snake, and snakes don't like that. So don't step on snakes. So anyway, then you remediate once you have it. Now you can upgrade your software. If it's open source, that is very easy because once the open source project is aware that they have a critical vulnerability, we have a CVE that is bad. Software in the open source world gets upgraded much more quickly than most proprietary software. So you can upgrading is usually a very good option for anything in your software supply chain that's open source. You can typically upgrade to something that does not have the problem. Or you can replace it with an alternative. If it's open source, there might be other pieces that do something similar, another open source project that will do something for you. Or if it's proprietary, maybe there's an open source solution that is more secure, that is a better fit for you. And then sometimes you just have to remove it altogether. You have to re-architect your software and work around the problem, right? But you do have to do these repeatedly. This is a DAR cycle. You run it once and then you have to run it again. You must be ever vigilant. It's not a one and done activity. And that's, of course, because software researchers and other people out there, they're constantly looking at pieces of the supply chain, pieces of open source software and other software, and looking for vulnerabilities. Hopefully they're fixing them, but they're always discovering vulnerabilities, which means there are more and more CVEs. Usually they're resolved, but that CVE, that total number, keeps going up, which means you constantly have to be looking at them. And then your own software supply chain, it's always in flux. You buy new software, you build new software, you upgrade other software, right? And so that's always in flux. So you have to keep running your DAR cycle, your discover, analyze, remediate cycle all the time. And again, good news, there are services that can help you do this. There are organizations that can help you set up a DAR cycle in your company, in your department, in your organization. There are companies that can help you with that and get that right for you. So you don't have to do it alone. You are not in this alone. Don't worry. There are people out there to help you. And you have to know that there's lots of people out there to do it. There's lots of software solutions out there to help you. There's lots of different approaches for it. If your company builds software, you might have one approach. If your company merely uses software, you might have another approach. There is definitely more than one way to do software supply chain security. The only way to do it wrong is not to do it at all, because that's when you're going to step over that rock and you're going to step on that snake and you're going to get bitten. And that's not fun. You don't want to get bitten. So if you would like to learn more, aside from what we're going to cover in the Q&A in just a couple of minutes here, I do have a few resources that can get you started. Number one is OpenSSF, which is the Open Source Security Foundation. It is a foundation under the Linux Foundation, and its goal is to try to improve the security of the entire open source ecosystem, which is a very large job. But they're doing a great job of it, and they are getting together, and you will find a lot of very friendly people there, and also incredibly knowledgeable people. This is a place where people who really care and know about open source security have come together to pool their knowledge and experience. And so you can learn a lot here. Similarly is OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Group. It has been around for quite a while. And again, lots of security professionals come here who want to help you. OWASP has international and local groups. So there might be one near you that you can get to go ask questions and learn more about this stuff. If you just want to watch experts doing their work and watch what happens and how security researchers do this, then keep an eye on Google Project Zero, because they are working to do this research on critical and popular software, open source and proprietary, and then not only finding vulnerabilities, but also patching them. And they have a blog here at googleprojectzero.blogspot.com that you can keep an eye on, and you can learn about just what are the processes they use and what their thinking paths for how they do this. And finally, there is SPDX, which, as I mentioned, is the ISO standard, international standard for SBOM formatting. Very friendly group. Very happy to help you with any sort of questions. Also, it is an open source project under the Linux Foundation. You can go there and ask questions at spdx.dev, or you can start by asking me questions now. I'm very grateful for being here, and let's see whether anybody has put any questions for me in the Q&A. I will just leave this slide up if anyone would like to contact me. Switch
Thank you very much, Dr. Vicky.
Yeah.
We have 5 minutes for questions. So anyone is having a question?
Let me see. I have, looks like 4 questions in Q&A. You see, from Khalil. Thanks, Vicky. Okay, Khalil would like to know why open source software supply chain discussions have really picked up in the last few years. Is it because of security issues highlighted due to abandoned open source supply chain? Sort of. It's not because necessarily of abandoned. It's because people, bad people are finding a lot more bugs because open source has gotten more popular. There's been a lot more of it. And so that's a larger attack surface for people. And so they're finding new and original ways to get in. And that leads to a lot more security problems, which leads to a lot more press about security problems, which leads to a lot more attention about security. And so that's why we're having a lot more talk about it right now. So that is, but there has been not necessarily abandoned, but under maintained projects just because there weren't enough people to do it. And that led to some critical problems. One in particular is called Heartbleed. That was a problem just a few years ago. And that really drew a lot of attention to this. That was the first really big one to draw attention. And it wasn't abandoned, but it was having a hard time because there weren't a lot of people who were able to fix it. Nobody was helping them. Let me see. I answered that one. Done. Next question. How many minutes do we have? I don't wish to run over.
We have 5 minutes, still 5 minutes.
Okay, we had 5 minutes 2 minutes ago, but okay.
2 other minutes.
Oh, thank you. I'm very grateful. Let me see. Do you think solo programmers who maintain critical open source supply chain are compensated and awarded fairly by the users, specifically corporates and governments? That depends. I think that's a very difficult question, and it depends upon, frankly, if it's a critical open source, if it's a critical link in the open source supply chain, it should not be a solo programmer. That's the problem. It's not whether they're getting paid, it's whether they have help to such that we have multiple people we can rely on rather than one. So I hope that answers your question, Mr. or Ms. Anonymous attendee. Is hardware failure considered as a break on software supply chain? Not usually, but it depends upon the nature of the hardware failure. If it's, for instance, a disk drive that just fails, that's not the software's fault. If it's a disk drive that gets too hot because it's spinning too quickly because the software can't control it, that's a software problem. So it really does depend upon the nature of the failure, but it can be software related. And, oh, my cat has come to say hello. One last question. Normally, in which part of the organization structure do bombs exist? This typically is going to be in the software development part of the structure, but it crosses over into other pieces such as legal, because these bombs also can be used for things like license compliance and contractual compliance and things like that. But they often, because they involve software and code, live or are created in the software development side of things. And that's all the questions that I have in the Q&A.